you, Steve, and thank you all. If I've learned anything, it is to put a little space between a very good presentation and the chance to talk. Both the opening homily and that monologue were spectacular, and really tell us where the future lies in the voices and minds and hearts and souls of young people. That's absolutely great. This will be a little bit of a riff. I've taken a great affection for Cornel West's presentations, which is to say that this doesn't have an organizing outline, but I hope we all go away learning a little bit more about FOR and where the peace movement is in the United States today. So why are we here tonight? Why are you here? Why am I here? As Steve suggests, the Fellowship of Reconciliation is 96 years old. And is there anyone in the room that's 96 years old? I ask because...
Older.
Older, okay.
He's closing in on 98.
Oh, wonderful. That's 2 nights in a row. I asked the question because yesterday there was a 90-something-year-old when I spoke. And so FOR was founded in England in 1914 when a English Quaker, Henry Hodgson, and a German Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Schulze-Schmidt, the chaplain to the Kaiser, found themselves literally being separated by the First World War. And on a train platform, they shook hands and promised they would not let the war come between their fellowship, their friendship. John R. Mott, who was the head of the World Student Christian Foundation, the head of the YMCA, the World YMCA, knew both Henry Hodgson and Friedrich and invited them in 1915 to come to a conference that he put together on social issues in America every summer on Long Island. And in 1915, they told the story of their covenant with one another, and 120 people in that audience stood up and created the Fellowship of Reconciliation, USA. Today we have 45 chapters and 65 affiliates. You are one of those affiliates across the United States, 18,000 members. Now, a membership is an act of conscience, not an act of the wallet. It is simply a statement that one is a committed pacifist, committed to nonviolent social action. And there's always room for contributed support. We survive on it, but it is an act of conscience. Kip Kozik, a professor at the American University of Beirut, wrote a book 2 years ago called Acts of Conscience, the Role of Christian Nonviolence and Modern American Democracy. Kip would say that we're here tonight, meeting as we are, because of the work of the Fellowship of Reconciliation around the world and in the United States, starting in 1914. Active nonviolence is a principle and is a practice, as we know it, as it shaped our lives as Americans, really grows out of two threads of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. One is the work of Muriel Lester, an English woman who introduced herself to Gandhi and became his principal ambassador, and thereby the ambassador of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, during the early part of the 20th century, whenever Churchill wasn't throwing her in jail somewhere in the world to try to slow her down. So it was Muriel Lester who first brought the Satyagraha concepts, the work of Gandhi, into our consciousness. The second thread is the thread brought to bear by Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley, both employees of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who, when a young Baptist pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King, was asked to become the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, A.J. Muste, the head of FOR, sent Glenn Smiley and Bayard Rustin to introduce King to the principles of nonviolence. You may have heard the story that when Bayard Rustin arrived at the King home, he found armed guards at the front door and weapons on the couches and chairs as he entered the house. And the first thing he said was, "All weapons must go." Glenn Smiley then gave King a reading list, and every time King went to jail, he took another work of Gandhi with him. So it's through the Fellowship of Reconciliation, internationally and nationally, that we come to know the power of the experiment in truth and the strength of love as the forces that solve conflict. I was born in 1947, and I call myself, or describe myself, I write those introductions, a poet doing the work of peacemaking, partly because I find that some of our strongest leads in the work we do comes from poetry. And if the Fellowship of Reconciliation has a poet laureate, it's William Stafford. So I'd like to share a poem from William Stafford, written in 1947, the year of my birth. The title is, "It Was This Way." Again, today I have not saved the world. My friends have been asking me to. But it took me so long to be neighbors that while I was trimming my hedge, a war between the Arabs and Jews began. And off across the country, my congressman dared 200 million Russians to come over and fight. Again today, I have not saved the world, and here it is, almost night. I've been traveling the world and the country almost continuously since about November 12th. I left the last National Council meeting of FOR at the end of October and went to the Netherlands for the quadrennial meeting of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. It meets every 4 years and brings together all 55 branches from around the world. This year we brought 3 new branches into membership. I'd like to just lift up in a sentence each. One from Chad. Chad is a largely illiterate and agrarian country. And the Chad Association for Nonviolence goes into Chad villages and teaches, and they learn by memory, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And then when the state, in any form of police, comes into their villages and threatens to take away land or take away sheep or otherwise constrain them, they recite chapter and verse the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it stops the abuse in its track. A simple act of nonviolence, but a powerful practice, I think. Another new member is from Burundi. We remember the genocide of Rwanda, but often as Americans have no well-formed picture of Africa, to say nothing of the rest of the world, and don't know that that violence actually spilled over and continues in Burundi and in the Congo and the Great Lakes area. And so in Burundi, they're still doing the work 10 years later of healing that follows from that genocide. That's the work of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. These last couple of weeks, we've watched with great anxiety and concern the plebiscite that the Sudanese people have been working their way through after a 5-year moratorium to decide if there's going to be a North and a Southern Sudan. SONAD is a new chapter of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in Sudan that's been involved for those entire 5 years, preparing for whatever the outcome might be, that people were prepared to respond in a peaceful way. So you're part of an organization that's present around the world through the International Fellowship of Reconciliation in that way. I want to tell you the other half of my story tonight by introducing some of the members of my staff, the Fellowship of Reconciliation USA, and tell you where they are tonight while we're here enjoying one another's company. Liza Smith is in Bogota, Colombia. We've been in Latin America through our task force in Latin America and the Caribbean for 21 years. The last 12 years, we've been living 3-4 young adults at a time in the villages of Yoruba province, in the village of La Union. Recent college graduates who are there in simple solidarity with a set of 10 peace villages, 1,200 people who've lost 150 of their members to extrajudicial killings and slayings over the last 10 years. Slayings by the government and the paramilitary to argue that our drug mitigation program is working because we're killing guerrillas. Well, what we're doing is killing innocent families in agrarian peace communities and dressing them up as guerrillas. And then recognizing, oh, that was a false positive. That really wasn't a guerrilla. But we'll count that statistic towards the proof that your $6 billion of U.S. foreign military aid is doing its job. Liza is taking the ambassador of Austria to La Union this next week as a part of a delegation, because one of those young people for the last year has been a woman from Austria of dual citizenship, Austrian and American. Tonight, John Lindsay Poland is in Ciudad Juarez, where at the invitation of dozens of Mexican pacifist organizations, people from all across the United States and Central America are gathering as a part of a vigil in the city of Juarez, where 7,000 people have lost their lives in violence in the last 3 years. We're there because one of the things we know is that Plan Colombia, which has shaped the violence in Colombia, is now being presented as Plan Meridan. The techniques of drug control that have failed in Colombia are now being offered by the United States as the mechanism to control violence in Mexico. At the same time, the ambassadorial staff from Colombia has been moved recently into posts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, because that's also where we're going to begin to use the Colombian model of the last 40 years to control drugs there. That's part of the work of our task force on Latin America and the Caribbean, part of the work of the Fellowship of Reconciliation USA. Leila Zan, the head of our Middle East task force, woman, mother of twins, expatriate from Iran, is the person who puts together 3 or 4 times a year our delegations to Iran of 10 to 12 people at a time, who go for 10 to 12 days as civilian diplomats, simply standing and walking through the streets and in the parks at the tombs of the poets throughout Afghanistan to bring the message from America that we aren't all planning to bomb Iran, that there are people who believe that there is a diplomatic solution. Layla stopped in Iran in December on her way to Kabul, Afghanistan, where she spent 10 days with Kathy Kelly and Mike Ferner from Veterans for Peace and some of the others from the creative nonviolence work that Kathy Kelly does. And they spent those 10 days with 12 young boys from Bamiyan, Afghanistan, the Afghan youth volunteers. These 10, 12 young boys have developed their own campaign. I mean, they are in sync. They understand how we work as peacemakers. And their campaign is called Our Journey to Smile. And their theme is, why not love? And the question that they ask of all of us, thank you, is why not love? And they ask it in a wonderfully contemporary way. You've mentioned YouTube. If you go to Our Journey to Smile, you'll find 120 video segments made over the last 2.5 years by these young boys and a couple of their sisters. The girls appear a little less often for their own protection. And they tell how the war affects young people in Afghanistan, and particularly in their village of Bamiyan. And through the work of FOR and others, they've begun a conversation now with young children from Gaza, and with kids from the Congo, and from kids from Colombia, and kids from the United States. And they are all talking about how do we change the world that our parents are leaving us and our grandparents, to a world where love is what guides our work, where we smile and talk with one another. So that's the work, part of the work of the Middle East Task Force. The last staff member who's out and about, I'll lift up, is Sean Pierce. Sean heads our task force on social, economic, and racial justice. And we've been involved over the last few months in Chicago at the invitation of a group of churches there to come in and try to work with those communities where 300 young people and some parents have been killed randomly in gun violence in the last 6 months of the last year. Something that most of us hear nothing about in our press, but there's a huge increase, particularly in random, abstract, but very real gun violence and fighting there. So Sean heads that delegation in that workup. The last staff member I want to mention for a number of reasons is Ethan Vesely-Flad. Ethan has put together this trip that I'm on. As I said, I started in November. I actually got in my car on December 4th, and for 21 days I've been driving across down the East Coast and across the United States. And I never have to drive more than 200 miles to find radical hospitality of some FOR family or friend, and a circle of people who are willing to spend a little bit of time sitting in a circle and talking about what's really important in their community today. Where is it that they need support? How can we link communities one to another? This is the new strategic plan of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, to re-engage with our local chapters and affiliates, and to seek and find ways that we can tie the work that's being done in Little Rock, the work that's being done in Arkansas, to that in Fort Worth. Yesterday we started a new chapter of FOR in Fort Worth, Texas. There's a history there, but it's been dormant for a while. Same thing in Trapp, Maryland on this trip. There are new chapters in Atlanta. I went all the way to Los Angeles in December, flew home for Christmas, and then earlier this week I flew back, pick up my car in Dallas where I'd left it, and I'll spend the next 20 days driving slowly back to Nyack and take to our next National Council meeting, which meets at the end of February, a report of the kinds of work that you're doing here, important and impressive work, and of the kinds of relationships that we have. So Ethan helped the logistics of that. Ethan is the editor of Fellowship Magazine, the head of our communications strategy, and I know that he's had conversations with a few of you in helping bring me through here this evening, and I want to thank Steve and others for the invitation. On the table in the back, please, if you don't see Fellowship Magazine on a regular basis, feel free to pick that up. Ms. West mentioned that we had a postcard. If you're on the FOR mailing list, you've recently seen an invitation to sign and send to the White House a postcard on reallocating those billions of dollars that fund foreign military work and bring it back home to do the work of improving the health and education and quality of life in this country. We're all watching with some anxiety what's going on in Egypt. I was also in Gaza in December a year ago. I thought, as I watched a little bit of television yesterday, that I could see the seeds of our visit there. The first day we were there, we gathered by flash mob techniques in front of the United Nations headquarters. And it took the Egyptian police about an hour to figure out that some 1,400 people from 42 countries had suddenly shown up with an intention to demonstrate through active nonviolence a desire to stand in solidarity with the Gazan people on the anniversary of the last attack. And they came and they lined up around the outside of us with barriers, and they brought a whole string of policemen with heavy masks and batons. But even there we started with the tools and the techniques of nonviolence. We simply turned and faced them, and we smiled, and we handed them pens, and we engaged them. Bilarabi, shwai shwai, a little bit of conversation in Arabic. The next day we showed up in front of the American Embassy for a similar kind of event. And it only took about half an hour for the police to get there. They had begun to understand what we were about. And they set up the barriers and they got out, but they didn't put their masks down. You could see their faces. And the third day we showed up in front of the Israeli Embassy and had another Sabbath service in front of the embassy there. And they came in their buses and they got out sort of slowly, and they did make a wall. By the last night, when we gathered in Tahrir Square, they didn't even get off on the buses. And I'm convinced that over a series of days, they saw more and more clearly that there was no physical threat represented by these 1,400 people from 42 countries who simply wanted to stand in solidarity with principally their Muslim brothers and sisters who were suffering under occupation. And so when I watched the television yesterday and saw the streamer saying that the police and the army had withdrawn from Cairo, that they weren't confronted, this doesn't mean they won't, and it doesn't mean that there won't be violence. But I'd like to believe that it was the model of our presence 2 years ago that helped plant some of those seeds. That's the way nonviolence grows and is distributed. So I want to tie these remarks together in a closing return to that poem by William Stafford and maybe a couple of other reflections of some of my favorite Persian poets. The message we heard by those two young women at the beginning and the end, that coupling, was, it does make a difference. I do care. There is hope. And the hope is in the spirit, the energy, the commitment they bring to this work. It's wonderful to see a number of kids here tonight, sons and daughters and others related to this work. So even though there's sort of a prophetic longing, a sense of despair in the words of Stafford, the poet laureate of our work, there still is hope. Again today, I have not saved the world. My friends have been asking me to. But it took me so long to be neighbors that while I was trimming my hedge, a war began between Arabs and Jews. And off across the country, my congressman dared 200 million Russians to come over and fight. Again today, I have not saved the world. And here it is, almost night. We do not have to reach back a generation or 2 or 20 to see the threats of genocide and the risks of stereotypes, the personifications of young men and women, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, as evil threats to civilization, threatened instead an apocalypse in parts of Africa and across America. How could the hands and hearts of loving companionship be so demonized except by ignorance? And how is it that the lust for combustion-driven conspicuous consumption, fed by the utter poverty that can only be relieved by growing crops of poppies and waving plains of hashish, can lead to the killing fields of Helmand and the broadcasting of body parts across the borderlands of Mexico and the United States. Addictions fed by a country that has lost its soul are so poisonous that they seem to dissolve the faces of children and women before the very eyes of gun-toting civil servants who blow them away as though they were digital packs of electrons in some video game on the screen. Today, in Murder City, as writer Charles Bowden calls it, Ciudad Juarez and the global economy's new killing field, a city of 7,000 members, and in El Paso, Texas, where the seepage of today's drug wars weeps across the border into Mexico. Witnesses gather to pay homage, to render homage to the dead. May we find our legacy at the tombs of poets rather than the graves of soldiers, in the flowered fields of the rain-awakened Sonoran rather than the ovens of Auschwitz. All the greatest poets of our traditions, Jesus, Abraham, Moses, Buddha and Muhammad, Zarathustra, and the anonymous pens of the Gita, Jeremiah and Isaiah, David and Micah, none of them blind to the horrors of war, all in the end offer words of the wholeness of the human spirit and the oneness of the universe, a creation to be celebrated and not destroyed. The great Afghan, Persian, Turkish Sufi poet Rumi, in one of his most quoted poems, "There is a field beyond," says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. More recently, the writing of Jean Knudsen Hoffman, who died last year, has reminded us that the enemy is the other whose story we do not know. Her path to compassionate listening is the path of peace. It is through the dialogue that stereotypes dissolve into empathy, into a shared humanity that would inoculate us against the threats of violence and genocide. Let me offer Hafiz, who often addressed himself in his poems, in a closing homage to that poet. The great religions are the ships. Poets are the lifeboats. Every sane person I know has jumped overboard. This is good for business, isn't it, Hafiz? Thank you.